33 souls. 33 lives, it said, claimed by the whispering woods of the Scottish Highlands. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest so old, so dark, that the very air around it seems to hold its breath. Now, what if a voice, a familiar voice, called your name from its depths? Would you answer? Would you dare? Jonathan Brooks certainly didn't. At least, not at first. He was a man of logic, a man who saw the world in facts and figures, not old wives' tales. He was traveling through the rugged, rain-lashed Scottish Highlands, a land that seemed to chew up daylight and spit out mist. The carriage rattled along, each jolt a stark reminder of how far from civilization he truly was. The landscape outside was a blur of grey, wet heather, and jagged black rock, the kind of place that made you feel small and insignificant. Low clouds hugged the hills, their peaks lost in a swirling, colourless haze. The last vestiges of daylight were already fading, even though evening was still hours away. He peered out the window, condensation blurring the glass. The driver, a man carved from granite and silence, noticed his gaze. "You'll find no proper path in there," he grunted, his eyes flicking towards the dense, ancient forest that sprawled across the hillside like a dark stain. Jonathan just wiped the mist from the glass. He hadn't yet decided to enter. The driver's grip tightened on the reins. "Best see that you do not." A humorless smile touched Jonathan's lips, but the driver's face remained a mask of grim warning. Then, a flash of lightning split the sky, and for a fleeting instant, the forest seemed to stretch impossibly far, its dark trees climbing ridge after ridge, vanishing into the clouds. Then, darkness swallowed it whole once more. The village of Dunre appeared as dusk was settling, a huddle of stone cottages huddled between the brooding forest and a narrow, restless inlet of the sea. Rain slicked their slate roofs, and smoke clung low to the chimneys, unable to escape the damp, heavy air. The land fell away sharply beyond the village, meeting a black, churning shore. The coach juddered to a halt before an old inn, its wooden sign creaking on rusty chains. A lone piper, silhouetted against a stark white moon, was painted across it. The Piper's Rest. A woman emerged as Jonathan stepped down. Tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair framing a stern, intelligent face. "You'll be Jonathan Brooks," she stated, her voice as solid as the stone buildings around them. "I am Margaret O'Reilly." She took his travel case, her movements efficient, and led him inside. "You have a room prepared only for tonight. Your own buffet is beyond the village, near the shore." Jonathan followed her gaze towards the sea, the roar of waves against rock a slow, heavy boom beneath the relentless rain. "Is it far?" he asked. "Half a mile, longer in weather such as this," Margaret replied. Inside, the inn was a haven of warmth, filled with the scent of peat smoke and the soft glow of lamplight. A few men sat at rough wooden tables, their conversations a low murmur that softened as Jonathan entered. He shrugged off his damp coat and found a spot near the hearth, the heat a welcome embrace. Margaret brought him a pint of ale, promising supper would follow. Jonathan had seen enough small, isolated villages to recognize the familiar dance of curiosity. A stranger arrived, conversation paused, and every eye turned, if only for a moment, to appraise him. By morning, he knew, half the village would know where he'd come from and why. He paid it little mind, until a name drifted from the nearest table, slicing through the comforting drone of the inn. "Morag." An elderly fisherman leaned in, his voice a raspy murmur. "She was seen beyond the burn," he said, a tremor of fear in his tone. One of the younger men scoffed. "A boy does not lose his voice from fright." The third man, however, glanced towards Jonathan and made a subtle warning gesture. The fisherman fell silent, his eyes downcast. Jonathan stood, a flicker of amusement touching his lips. "Forgive me," he said, his voice clear. "Who is Morag?" Silence. No one answered. Margaret, behind the bar, held a glass motionless in her hands. Jonathan offered a polite smile. "A local woman?" A gruff voice answered, "Not a woman." "That is enough, Angus." Margaret's sharp tone cut through the air. Jonathan turned, curiosity now a definite spark. "Now you've made me curious." "That is rarely a blessing." Margaret set down the glass and approached the fire, her expression softening slightly. Morag is a name from an old tale, she said, her voice low. Older than this village. Jonathan glanced towards the rain-lashed window. And what does the tale say? That she dwells in the forest, Margaret replied. What is she supposed to be? A younger man, his face pale, crossed himself. A witch? Jonathan concealed his smile. I see. No, Margaret said, her gaze steady. You do not. The fire shifted, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Angus stared into his ale, his knuckles white. Those who meet Morag, he murmured, die before the next full moon. Jonathan studied the faces around the table. None of them seemed to be joking. You believe this? He asked. My grandfather saw her when he was 19, Angus said, his voice barely a whisper. He returned before dawn, and never spoke of what happened. 12 days later, the fisherman added, his voice trembling, they found him dead in the peach shed. No injury, no sickness, only a black mark around his wrist. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. And this occurred how many years ago? 67, Angus replied. Jonathan let out a breath. A story repeated for 67 years is not evidence. Margaret's eyes narrowed, a glint of defiance in their depths. A story repeated for centuries is not necessarily a lie. Supper arrived then, and the conversation shifted, but Jonathan found his gaze returning again and again to the window. Rain ran down the glass like silver tears. Beyond it, the wind moved inland from the sea, a restless spirit sighing towards the forest. A moment later, something seemed to sigh in the chimney, a sound that, for just an instant, resembled a woman breathing. Gregory Colum arrived shortly after 9. He was a lean, solemn man, his beard grey and flecked with salt, his coat stained by the sea. He greeted Jonathan politely, but spoke little as they left the Piper's Rest and began their walk towards the shore. The rain had softened, though the wind remained a boisterous companion. Gregory carried a lantern, its light a bobbing beacon guiding Jonathan along a narrow track beyond the last of the cottages. They stood alone above the sea, before a squat stone building with a slate roof and 2 chimneys. Before it lay a rugged cliff, and the black water churned below. Behind it, perhaps 200 yards away, the ancient forest climbed over the ridge. The waves were louder here, striking the rocks with deep, hollow blows. Between each impact came the sound of water dragging over stone, a whispering hiss like something breathing through broken teeth. Gregory unlocked the bothy. Inside, it was simple, a main room, a narrow kitchen, and a small sleeping chamber. A peat fire glowed weakly in the hearth, the thick, rough stone walls dark with age. It appears comfortable enough, Jonathan said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Gregory nodded, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. In fair weather, and in weather like this, he said, his voice a low rumble, you will hear the sea, the chimney, and the stones settling. Do not let them trouble you. Jonathan smiled, a touch of his earlier skepticism returning. You make it sound as though they might, he replied. Gregory showed him the provisions, the water pump, and the heavy iron bolt on the door. As he prepared to leave, Jonathan paused. I heard the story of Morag. Gregory's hand tightened around the lantern. Margaret should not have filled your head with it. The fisherman did, Jonathan corrected. Angus lived too long among old memories. So, you do not believe him? Gregory looked towards the window, where rain still shivered against the glass. I believe some places should be left alone. Jonathan nodded. That is not the same answer. No? At the doorway, Gregory paused again. The forest path begins behind the ridge. Do not follow it after sunset. I had no intention of doing so, Jonathan assured him. Gregory studied him for a moment, his gaze intense. And should you hear a woman calling your name among the trees, do not answer. It matters little whose voices she uses. Jonathan laughed softly. So you do believe it? Gregory opened the door, and a gust of wind and salt air swept into the bothy. I believe warnings exist because someone once failed to heed them. Then he disappeared into the rain. Jonathan slept badly that night. The sea seemed to have no rest. Each wave struck the cliff below with a muffled boom that vibrated through the very floor. The wind prowled around the bothy, moaning in the chimney like a lost soul. Sometime after midnight, Jonathan was jolted awake by 3 faint knocks. He sat up, listening. The sound came again, not from the door, but from within the stone wall beside his bed. 3 taps. A pause. Then 3 more. Jonathan placed his hand against the stone. It was cold, and perfectly solid. Perhaps a branch scraping the outer wall, he murmured, and lay down again. The tapping stopped. In the morning, the forest stood beneath a low ceiling of cloud. Its upper branches shifted restlessly in the wind, but the darkness below remained unnervingly still. Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest that afternoon. Margaret set a pint before him without being asked. The inn was busier than before, filled with the low hum of conversation from fishermen, shepherds, and railway men discussing broken nets, missing sheep, and a landslip on the northern road. Eventually, as if drawn there by some invisible thread, the conversation returned to Morwick. A railway porter named Malcolm spoke of a woman found wandering near the forest 20 years earlier. She had been barefoot, despite the frozen ground, and kept insisting that someone followed her. She died before the full moon, he said. From what? Jonathan asked. She stopped breathing. A hush fell over the inn. People do not die with black water running from their mouths. Silence spread. Jonathan lifted his glass, a wry smile playing on his lips. Every unexplained death in Dunre appears to have been given to this witch. A man dies in a shed. A woman falls ill. A boy becomes frightened. And Morwick receives the blame. What would you blame? Angus asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Fear, disease, loneliness, drink. Margaret placed another block of peat on the fire, the flames leaping higher. You seem determined to be disappointed by our legends. On the contrary, Jonathan replied, they are fascinating. Then you better admire them from a distance, Margaret said softly. Jonathan returned the following evening, and the evening after that. The Piper's Rest became a part of his routine. He ate there, drank a few pints, and listened to the locals exchange their gossip. But always, the forest seemed to find its way into their conversations. There was a hunter who returned with blood upon his hands, but no wound upon his body. A shepherd who heard his dead mother call from among the pines. A family who heard voices inside their walls after the father crossed the forest burn. Jonathan challenged every account. He pointed out contradictions, demanded dates, and supplied ordinary explanations. The villagers, he noted, were certainly irritated. They did not merely fear Morwick. They accepted her as one accepts winter, or the sea. The more they warned him, the more determined he became to prove them wrong. On his 5th evening at the inn, he announced his intention to enter the forest. No one laughed. Margaret's expression hardened. You have walked near it already, along the edge. That is far enough. I intend to go farther tomorrow, Jonathan said, his voice firm. Anger tightened his grip on his glass. Do not. Jonathan smiled. You cannot expect me to believe that a witch has lived among those trees for centuries. She does not live as you understand living, Angus said. And then I am unlikely to meet her. One of the shepherds rose and left without finishing his ale. The sudden silence unsettled Jonathan more than any argument. Margaret leaned towards him, her gaze earnest. You arrived as a guest. Do not make yourself into another warning. Gregory visited the bothy that night. Margaret told you, Jonathan said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. She did. I'm taking a walk, nothing more. Leave the forest alone. Jonathan folded his arms. You have repeated these stories so long that you no longer hear how absurd they sound. Gregory glanced towards the wall beside the sleeping chamber. Have the stones made any noises? Tapping, Jonathan admitted. The building is old. How many times? Jonathan hesitated. 3. Gregory's face changed. Do not go there tomorrow. There is nothing there. I don't care what name you give the thing that waits in those woods. Gregory stepped closer. If a woman calls your name, do not answer. She may sound young or old. She may sound like someone you loved. Do not answer. Something scratched faintly within the far wall. Both men heard it. Gregory looked towards the sound. Leave in the morning, he said. Jonathan entered the forest the following evening. He waited until late afternoon, then took a lantern and followed the narrow path behind the ridge. The trees closed around him almost immediately. At first, the forest appeared ordinary. Rainwater clung to moss and dripped from the branches. The earth smelled of pine, rot, and wet bark. The noise of the sea faded behind him. After half an hour, the path narrowed beneath ancient trunks and roots that twisted through the ground like black veins. The wind moved high above the canopy, but below, the air remained unnaturally still. Then the birds fell silent. Jonathan stopped. No wing stirred. No creature moved among the leaves. Even the distant surf had vanished. The forest seemed to be listening. He continued. Soon, he found a standing stone, half buried beneath moss. Symbols had been carved across its surface. Some were worn smooth with age, others appeared freshly cut. Jonathan touched one. The groove was wet. Something moved behind him. He turned. Nothing stood between the trunks. Farther on, his compass needle began to tremble. It turned slowly, then pointed in a direction he knew could not be north. A sound came from ahead. Breathing. Jonathan raised the lantern. The flame bent sideways, though the air was still. Who is there? He called. The breathing ceased. A branch cracked behind him. The path by which he had come was gone. Dense trunks and thorn now stood in its place. Mist gathered between the trees. Then, a woman whispered his name. John. He froze. Gregory's warning returned to him. Do not answer. The voice came again, closer. Jonathan. He gripped the lantern. Jonathan. He turned. No one was there. Who is it? He called. The forest inhaled. Whispers rose on every side. They came from the branches, beneath the roots, and within the hollow trunks. Ahead, a pale figure stood between two trees. Jonathan did not see her arrive. She was simply there, tall and motionless, dressed in black garments ragged at the hem. Long hair concealed much of her face. Jonathan tried to step back. His body refused. The name entered Jonathan's mind. Morag. She approached. She raised one hand, her blackened fingers closing around Jonathan's wrist. Cold entered his blood. The forest vanished. Jonathan awoke at dawn near the forest edge, soaked with dew and mud. His lantern was missing. For several minutes, he remembered nothing. Then fragments returned. A pale face, voices beneath the earth, fingers closing over his skin. A black mark encircled his wrist. He rubbed it hard. It did not fade. Gregory found him walking unsteadily towards the bothy. You went, he said. I became lost. Gregory saw the mark. What did you see? Nothing. Do not lie. I was tired. I fell and struck my head. Did she call your name? Jonathan looked away. Did you answer? I dreamed it. Gregory released him. Dreams do not have marks. That evening, Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest. The villagers stared as he entered. Well, he said, taking his usual seat. I entered your forest. No one replied. And I found no witch. Margaret's gaze fell upon his wrist. What did you find? Mud, trees, a poor sense of direction. Nothing else? Nothing. She placed a tankard before him. Then why do you look as though something followed you out? That night, the tapping returned. 3 knocks sounded from within the wall beside Jonathan's bed. Then 3 more. He lit the lamp. The sound stopped. Jonathan pressed his ear against the stone. At first, he heard only the distant sea. Then, something whispered from inside the wall. He spent the rest of the night beside the fire. In the morning, the chair beside the hearth had been turned towards the sleeping chamber. The front door was unlocked. Jonathan told himself he had walked in his sleep. The following night, the fire died without warning. One moment, peak glowed red. The next, the room was dark. Jonathan relit the lamp. A scraping moved slowly across the western wall, beginning near the floor and traveling upward, as though fingernails dragged over the stone from within. Jonathan struck the wall with the iron poker. The scraping stopped. Something struck back. Once, twice, 3 times. Dust fell from the ceiling. A low, wet laugh sounded behind the stones. By daylight, the bothy no longer felt empty. Objects shifted whenever Jonathan turned away. A spoon fell from the center of the table. The kettle lid lifted and clattered to the floor. The small mirror above the washstand clouded as though someone had breathed upon it. Then, slowly, letters appeared. Stillhere. Still here. Jonathan wiped it away. It returned. At the Piper's Rest, he drank more than usual. "You should not remain alone tonight," Margaret said. "I am perfectly well." "You have not slept. The sea is loud." "The sea was loud before you entered the forest," Jonathan replied, looking down at his drink. "What do you hear in the bothy?" she asked. "Nothing. Gregory told me about the tapping." "He imagines danger everywhere," Margaret said, leaning closer. "If the voices begin, do not answer them." That night, a storm rose from the sea. Rain hammered the roof. Wind screamed around the bothy. Waves struck the cliffs with such force that the floor trembled beneath Jonathan's feet. Shortly before midnight, footsteps approached from the direction of the forest. Slow, dragging, they circled the bothy and stopped outside the door. 3 knocks. Jonathan did not move. 3 more. Then, Gregory's voice called from outside. "Jonathan, open the door." Jonathan approached. "Gregory, let me in." His hand moved toward the bolt. Then he remembered the forest. "Why are you here?" No answer. "Gregory, open the door." The voice was nearly perfect. Beneath it, however, another voice spoke at the same time, deeper and guttural, shaping the words too slowly. Jonathan backed away. The knocking grew louder. Gregory's voice became Margaret's, then Angus's. Then Jonathan's dead sister. Jonathan covered his ears. The knocking ceased. All 4 walls began to whisper. Hundreds of voices moved through the stone. Some prayed. Some sobbed or laughed. Others repeated Jonathan's name in accents from different countries and centuries. The fire turned blue. The lamp flame shrank. A child's voice spoke beside Jonathan's ear. "She is coming through." The stones beside the chimney bulged inward. Mortar cracked. Dust spilled onto the floor. The outline of a face pressed through the wall, as if the rock had become soft flesh. Its mouth opened. A demonic voice shook the room. "I'm still here." Jonathan hurled the poker. The face vanished. Every object in the bothy rose into the air. Chairs, cups, plates, and bottles hung motionless for a single, terrible instant. Then everything crashed down. The lamp went out. From the sleeping chamber came the sound of someone breathing. Jonathan struck a match. Her face was inches from his own. The flame died. Jonathan fled. He did not remember removing the bolt. One moment he stood in darkness with Morag behind him. The next, he was running barefoot through the storm. Rain blinded him. The sea roared below. Behind him, the bothy windows glowed red. Shapes moved within. Dozens of them. Jonathan reached the cliff and stopped. Far below, a woman stood in the surf. Morag looked up at him. Her black dress spread across the water like oil. The dead stood around her. The hunter, the drowned woman, a frozen child, and others without faces. Morag raised one hand and pointed towards the moon, struggling behind the clouds. Jonathan collapsed. Gregory found him at dawn near the bothy. The storm had passed, but the sea remained violent. Grey waves rolled beneath the colorless sky. The forest dripped silently behind the ridge. Inside, the room lay in ruins. Furniture had been overturned. Broken dishes covered the floor. Black stains marked the walls. The stone beside the chimney was split from floor to ceiling. Jonathan opened his eyes. "I'm leaving," he whispered. Gregory nodded. "You should have left before." Jonathan returned to the Piper's Rest that afternoon to say goodbye. The inn fell silent when he entered. He looked 20 years older than the man who had arrived. His skin was grey, his eyes hollow, and his hand so unsteady that he could barely fasten his coat. Margaret came around the bar. "Stay until morning." "No, the train leaves after dark." "Then take tomorrow's." Jonathan glanced at the windows. Mist had already begun to gather over the village. "I have stayed too long." Gregory stood near the fire. "You cannot outrun what has marked you." Jonathan forced a thin smile. "You still believe I saw her?" "You do too." The smile vanished. Jonathan looked around the inn. No one mocked him. No one appeared pleased to have been proven right. "I came to tell you that nothing happened," he said. "There was wind in the walls, rats, exhaustion." "No one here requires you to lie," Margaret said. A faint whisper came from the chimney. "John." His eyes moved towards it. No one else reacted. He took his glass. "Goodbye, Mrs. O'Reilly." "Jonathan," he stopped. "Do not board that train." He opened the door. Cold mist entered the inn. "I'm going home." The station lay several miles from Dunre, a small platform beside a single line. By the time Jonathan arrived, darkness covered the Highlands. The night train came shortly before 10. Steam rolled across the platform. Dim lamps glowed behind rain-streaked windows. Jonathan boarded a carriage near the rear. For the first time in days, he felt safe. The upholstered seats, steady lamps, and rhythmic wheels belonged to the rational world. Dunre and its forest began to fall behind. Jonathan closed his eyes. When he opened them, an old man sat opposite him. The seat had been empty before. The man wore an old-fashioned hunting coat. Mud covered his boots. His face was rigid and pale. Beside him sat a woman with seawater dripping from her dress. Farther down the carriage, a child stared through the window, frost glittering in his hair. Other passengers occupied the adjoining compartment. None spoke. None breathed. Their clothing came from different ages. Some were wet, burned, or covered in earth. Others bore ropes or dark marks around their throats. Slowly, the hunter turned his head. His eyes were black. The drowned woman looked towards Jonathan. The child turned from the window. One by one, every passenger faced him. Jonathan stood. The lamps flickered. Outside, the countryside vanished. The ancient forest rushed past the windows. Branches scraped against the carriage, as if the train were passing through the heart of the woods. Jonathan pulled at the door. It would not open. The lamps went out one by one, beginning at the far end. With each dying light, a passenger rose. The dead filled the aisle. Morag stood at the end of the carriage. Her hair moved in an unseen wind. Beneath the pale skin of her face, other faces shifted and opened their mouths. Jonathan remembered everything. Her voice in the forest, her fingers upon his wrist, the endless procession of souls among the trees. He remembered seeing himself standing with them. Morag walked towards him. The dead parted. Jonathan struck the locked door. "Help me." The spirits repeated his plea. "Help me." Morag stopped before him. The mark around his wrist began to burn. She placed her hand over it. For one instant, Jonathan saw the bothy, the black shore, and the forest beneath the moon. He saw every soul Morag had claimed walking endlessly among the trees. Then he saw his own body sitting upright in the railway carriage, its face frozen in terror. His heart stopped. The next thing he remembered was stepping from a train at the station in his hometown. Morning had come. Porters moved luggage through clouds of steam. Families greeted one another beneath the iron roof. Jonathan felt strangely light. The mark no longer hurt. He looked back. The Highland carriage was gone. He left the station and entered the familiar streets. Shopkeepers raised shutters. Carriages rolled over wet cobbles. Church bells sounded nearby. Dunre seemed impossibly distant. Jonathan saw Mr. Wilkes, an acquaintance from his club, approaching. "Wilkes." The man continued walking. Jonathan raised a hand. "Good morning." Wilkes passed without looking at him. A woman carrying a basket walked directly towards Jonathan. He stepped aside, but she did not alter her course. She passed through him. Cold spread through his body. The woman shivered and glanced over her shoulder before moving on. Jonathan entered a shop. The bell above the door did not ring. The assistant stood behind the counter. "I require a cab," Jonathan said. The man did not look up. Jonathan struck the counter. There was no sound. His fingers appeared pale and almost transparent. A mirror hung upon the opposite wall. The shop, the counter, and the assistant were reflected clearly. Jonathan was not. He stumbled back into the street. People flowed around him without seeing him. He called to them. He shouted, but no one turned. Across the road, a newspaper boy held up the morning edition. Jonathan saw his own face beneath the headline. "Local traveler found dead on Highland train." He crossed the street. The article reported that Jonathan Brooks had been discovered dead inside a railway carriage after leaving a remote village in the Scottish Highlands. There were no wounds. No cause of death had been established. His body had been removed at the station, more than 100 miles from his hometown. The expression upon his face suggested extreme terror. Jonathan read the article again. Then he looked at his hands. Behind him, a woman whispered his name. "Jonathan." He closed his eyes. The voice came again. The noise of the town began to fade. Footsteps, carriage wheels, and human voices dissolved into wind moving through trees. Jonathan turned. Morag stood at the far end of the street. The dead passengers gathered behind her. The hunter, the drowned woman, the frozen child. The buildings disappeared into mist. Cobblestones became wet earth. The walls of the town rose into ancient trunks. The smell of salt returned. Somewhere beyond the trees, waves struck a black shore. Morag turned and entered the forest. The spirits followed. Jonathan tried to remain where he stood. The mark returned around his wrist. Invisible hands closed upon him. He joined the procession. Days later, Gregory Column entered the bothy beside the sea. Black stains remained upon the walls. The cracked stones beside the chimney had not moved. The chair stood facing the bed. From within the wall came 3 faint knocks. Gregory closed the door and never rented the bothy again. At the Piper's Rest, Margaret O'Reilly continued serving fishermen, shepherds, and the occasional traveler who found his way to Dunre. Sometimes strangers asked about the ancient forest. Some laughed when they heard the name Morag. Others declared that witches belonged to old stories and frightened minds. When that happened, the villagers fell silent. Margaret looked towards the black trees beyond the windows, and she told them about Jonathan Brooks, the skeptic who entered the forest, answered a woman calling his name, and boarded the night train home. She told them how he returned to his hometown without knowing that he was dead. And whenever the wind moved down from the forest and whispered through the chimney of the Piper's Rest, No one in Dunre answered, for they knew that Morag was still listening, and that the next full moon was never far away. Well then, you've made it all the way to the end. Some listeners leave early. Some grow uneasy when the night grows too quiet, but you stayed. And if you enjoyed tonight's ghostly tale, feel free to like the video, share it with a fellow night wanderer, and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the lantern burning and the stories coming. Thank you for listening.